By September 1944, the Allied armies had achieved the unthinkable. Following the successful Normandy landings in June, they had broken out of the hedgerow country of northern France and begun a breathtaking race across Europe. Paris was liberated on August 25th, and as the summer drew to a close, Allied spearheads were pushing into Belgium and nearing the German frontier. The Wehrmacht, which had seemed so invincible for years, appeared to be shattered, a disorganized rabble streaming in full retreat towards the fatherland. An intoxicating optimism swept through the Allied command. There was a palpable sense that the war, which had consumed the world for 5 long years, could be over by Christmas. However, this rapid advance had created a severe problem. The Allied supply lines, stretching all the way back to the beaches of Normandy, were strained to the breaking point. The logistical miracle known as the Red Ball Express, a massive, continuous truck convoy system, was struggling to keep the frontline armies fueled and armed. Every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell, had to be transported hundreds of miles. This logistical crisis forced a critical debate among the senior Allied commanders. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, favored a broad front strategy, advancing all his armies towards Germany simultaneously. This was a cautious, methodical approach that ensured no single part of the line would be overextended or vulnerable to counterattack. In stark opposition stood the British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group. Montgomery was a man of immense self-confidence and professional pride, a meticulous planner who believed in concentrating overwhelming force at a single decisive point. He argued passionately for a bold, single thrust, a rapier-like strike into the heart of Germany. He proposed halting the other Allied armies, primarily those of the American General George S. Patton, and diverting all available logistical support to his 21st Army Group for a knockout blow through the Netherlands, outflanking Germany's formidable defensive Siegfried Line and seizing the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. Eisenhower, a master of coalition command, sought a compromise. While he would not completely halt Patton's advance, he was intrigued by Montgomery's audacious concept and was willing to sanction a major operation if the potential prize was large enough. That prize was a plan of breathtaking audacity, a gamble of epic proportions that would be codenamed Operation Market Garden. The plan was a 2-part operation. The market phase was the responsibility of the newly formed 1st Allied Airborne Army, commanded by the American Lieutenant General Lewis H. Brereton, though the operational command on the ground would fall to British Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning. It would be the largest airborne operation in history, involving 3 full divisions. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, commanded by Major General Maxwell Dye Taylor. The U.S. 82nd Airborne Division, the All-Americans, under the brilliant and aggressive Brigadier General James M. Gavin, and the British 1st Airborne Division, the Red Devils, commanded by Major General Roy Urquhart. Their task was to drop deep behind enemy lines in the Netherlands and seize a series of key bridges over the numerous rivers and canals that fragmented the landscape. The 101st would drop furthest south, tasked with securing the bridges around Eindhoven. North of them, the 82nd would take the bridges at Grave and, crucially, the massive road bridge over the Waal River at Nijmegen. Furthest north, 64 miles behind the front lines, the British 1st Airborne, along with the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, would be given the most difficult task of all, the capture of the final bridge over the Lower Rhine at a town called Arnhem. The garden phase was the ground component, to be carried out by the British Second Army's 66 Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks. This powerful armored force was to advance north along a single road, linking up with the airborne divisions in succession, relieving them and consolidating control of the captured bridges, from Eindhoven through Nijmegen and finally to Arnhem. Horrocks's tanks were expected to cover the 64 miles in no more than 2 to 3 days. Once they crossed the Rhine at Arnhem, the path would be clear to pivot east, bypass the Siegfried Line, and plunge into the Ruhr. The war, Montgomery believed, would be as good as won. It was a plan of dazzling elegance and immense risk. Its success depended on 3 critical assumptions: that the German resistance in the Netherlands was weak and disorganized, that the airborne troops could seize and hold the bridges for the required 2 to 3 days, and that Tentein's corps could advance rapidly up what would soon be known as Hell's Highway. When General Browning asked Montgomery how long the British 1st Airborne would have to hold the Arnhem Bridge, Montgomery replied, 2 days. Browning then turned to his own staff and noted they could likely hold it for 4. It was then that he made a remark that would become steeped in tragic irony, a chilling premonition of the events to come. Looking at the map, at the final, distant objective, he mused, "But, sir, I think we might be going a bridge too far." The optimism that fueled the plan was not without basis, but it led to a series of critical intelligence failures. Reports from the Dutch resistance indicating the presence of German panzer units near Arnhem were dismissed as unreliable or exaggerated. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showing what appeared to be German tanks were explained away as damaged or unserviceable vehicles. The Allied command, in its eagerness to believe the Wehrmacht was broken, had fallen victim to confirmation bias. They saw what they wanted to see. In reality, the Germans were not nearly as defeated as the Allies presumed. Hitler, infuriated by the rapid retreat, had appointed Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt to restore order on the Western Front. More importantly, the very area chosen for the operation was now under the command of one of the Wehrmacht's most formidable defensive strategists, Field Marshal Walter Model. Model was a master of improvisation and had an uncanny ability to patch together broken units and form effective battle groups from the remnants of defeated divisions. By a remarkable twist of fate, when the Allied paratroopers began to land, Model's headquarters was located in the village of Oosterbeek, right next to the British landing zones. Even more ominously, and completely unknown to Allied intelligence, the 6th SS Panzer Corps, comprising the 9th Hohenstaufen and 10th Frundsberg SS Panzer Divisions, had been sent to the Arnhem area to rest and refit. While they were severely under strength, they were not the broken rabble the Allies expected. They were veteran formations, filled with experienced and fanatical troops, and they possessed a corps of tanks, self-propelled guns, and armoured vehicles. The British 1st Airborne Division, equipped only with light infantry weapons, was about to drop directly on top of 2 of the German army's most elite units. The stage was set for a monumental clash of arms, a battle that would pit audacity and courage against desperation and resilience. Sunday, September 17th, 1944, dawned clear and bright. From airfields across England, a vast armada took to the skies. Over 2,000 transport aircraft and gliders carried the first wave of nearly 20,000 soldiers. For the men of the airborne divisions, it was a strangely peaceful journey. The massive formation flew in broad daylight, a testament to the Allied air supremacy that made such an operation conceivable. The German anti-aircraft fire was surprisingly light, and the initial landings were remarkably successful. The paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Divisions descended from the sky in a blizzard of green silk, landing with great accuracy on their designated drop zones. To the south, Maxwell Taylor's 101st Airborne, quickly began to consolidate its positions. They secured the bridges over the Wilhelmina Canal at Sonn and the Dommel River in Eindhoven, but not without a critical setback. As American engineers approached the Sonn Bridge, German defenders detonated pre-planted charges, sending the main span crashing into the water. This single act of demolition would have profound consequences, creating the first of many delays for the advancing ground troops. Further north, James Gavin's 82nd Airborne achieved spectacular initial success. They swiftly captured the massive 11-span bridge over the Maas River at Grave, one of the key objectives of the entire operation, taking it intact before the Germans could react. They also seized several other smaller bridges and, crucially, secured the vital Groesbeek Heights, a ridge of high ground overlooking the surrounding flatlands and the city of Nijmegen. Possession of these heights would protect the division's drop zones from German attack and provide an excellent observation post. However, the main prize in their sector, the huge road bridge over the Waal River at Nijmegen, remained stubbornly in enemy hands. The story was tragically different for the British 1st Airborne Division at the northernmost end of the airborne carpet. Their drop zones had been selected 8 miles west of the Arnhem Bridge. This decision was made out of a fear of flak batteries, presumed to be located closer to the town, and because the boggy ground near the bridge was deemed unsuitable for the division's gliders. This distance would prove to be a fatal flaw in the plan. The division's commander, Major General Roy Urquhart, a tough infantryman with no experience in airborne operations, intended for his force to advance rapidly to the bridge in 3 separate groups. The 1st Parachute Brigade was to lead the way. Almost immediately things began to go wrong. The flimsy radios issued to the British paratroopers failed to work in the wooded terrain. With communications breaking down, Urquhart quickly lost control of his division. The advance into Arnhem, which was supposed to be a swift coup de main, turned into a slow, grinding battle. The Germans, initially stunned by the scale of the landing, reacted with surprising speed and ferocity. Elements of the 9th SS Panzer Division, commanded by SS Brigadeführer Wilhelm Bittrich, were perfectly positioned to block the British advance. Instead of facing a handful of demoralized second-rate troops, the Red Devils ran into a buzzsaw of determined resistance from battle-hardened veterans. Only one British unit managed to get through the tightening German cordon. The 2nd Parachute Battalion, commanded by the charismatic and unflappable Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, took a southern route along the riverbank that was less heavily defended. By late evening on that first day, Frost and his roughly 700 men reached their objective. They stormed the northern end of the great steel bridge at Arnhem, digging in and preparing to hold it against all comers. They were the only Allied unit to reach the prize. Isolated and alone, they fortified the houses and buildings surrounding the bridge ramp, expecting to be relieved by Horrocks tanks within 48 hours. As Frost's men began their lonely vigil at Arnhem, Tomutantang's Corps began its part of the operation. At 2:35 p.m. on September 17th, a colossal artillery barrage erupted from the British lines, and the Guards' armoured division lurched forward, beginning its 64-mile journey up the single road that led to Arnhem. From the very first yard, the advance was slow. The road, raised on a dike above the flat, marshy polderland, was narrow and exposed. It created a perfect shooting gallery for the handful of German anti-tank guns and bazooka teams that had been hastily assembled to defend it. The lead tanks were repeatedly knocked out, blocking the entire column behind them. Each time the advance would halt, the infantry would have to dismount and clear the enemy from the ditches and houses alongside the road, and the engineers would have to clear the wreckage before the column could inch forward again. This frustrating pattern would repeat itself endlessly. The road became known as Hell's Highway, a corridor of fire and destruction. By the end of the first day, the Guards' armored division had only advanced 7 miles, falling far short of the planned timetable. They were still miles from their first objective, Eindhoven, and the bridge at Sun was already gone. The intricate clockwork of Operation Market Garden was already falling dangerously out of sync. The gap between the ground forces and the airborne troops was widening with every passing hour. For John Frost's men at Arnhem, the ticking of the clock was growing louder. On the second day, Monday, September 18th, the situation for the British at Arnhem deteriorated rapidly. The other 2 battalions of the 1st Parachute Brigade, the 1st and 3rd, launched a determined attack to break through the German blocking line and reach Frost's position at the bridge. They ran into a wall of fire. The Germans, now fully aware of the British objective, had reinforced their positions with elements from both the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions. The British paratroopers, fighting with incredible bravery, were cut to pieces in the streets and woods west of Arnhem. Casualties were catastrophic. The battalions were shattered as effective fighting units, the survivors forced back towards the landing zones. General Urquhart, who had gone forward to get a sense of the battle, found himself cut off and trapped in an attic, with a small group of officers for nearly 2 days, completely out of touch with his division at a critical time. Meanwhile, at the bridge, Frost's men were now completely surrounded. They fought off repeated German attacks with grim determination. The Germans, unable to dislodge them with infantry, began to systematically demolish the British positions with tanks, artillery, and self-propelled guns. The fighting was savage and claustrophobic, taking place from house to house, room to room. The buildings held by the paratroopers were set ablaze, but they refused to yield, their Piat anti-tank projectors and machine guns taking a heavy toll on the attackers. They were holding their end of the bargain, but their situation was growing more desperate with every hour. Ammunition was running low, and casualties were mounting. They scanned the southern horizon constantly, listening for the sound of Horrocks' tanks, but all they heard was the growing crescendo of the German assault. Further south, the battle for Hell's Highway raged on. The Guards' armored division finally linked up with the 101st Airborne in Eindhoven on the 18th, but the destroyed bridge at Sun presented a major obstacle. While US and British engineers worked frantically to construct a temporary Bailey Bridge, the entire Kextiax Corps column was forced to halt. The delay was 24 hours long, a lifetime in the context of the operation. Throughout their sector, the 101st Airborne was engaged in a series of fierce battles to keep Hell's Highway open. German battle groups, scraped together by General Model, launched repeated attacks on the vulnerable road, cutting it on several occasions. The Screaming Eagles found themselves spread thin, fighting in all directions to protect the vital artery. Each time the road was cut, the advance of Kextiax Corps was halted. The paratroopers became known as the New Dutch Masters because they were constantly plugging the dikes. In the 82nd Airborne's sector around Nijmegen, General Gavin's paratroopers were also under pressure. They successfully repelled German attacks on the Groesbeek Heights, but the all-important road bridge at Nijmegen remained in German hands. The Germans had pushed reinforcements into the city, and they defended it tenaciously. Without the Nijmegen bridge, Kextiax Corps could not advance to Arnhem. The entire operation was now balanced on a knife's edge. By Tuesday, September 19th, the 3rd day of the operation, the Bailey Bridge at Sun was finally complete, and Kextiax Corps resumed its advance. The Guards' armored division pushed north and linked up with the 82nd Airborne near Grave. But the problem of the Nijmegen Bridge remained. The Germans were dug in on the southern approaches, and the bridge itself was heavily defended. A direct frontal assault by the tanks of the Guards' armored division was deemed suicidal. A new, incredibly risky plan was formulated. While the Guards and some American paratroopers would attack the southern end of the bridge, a battalion of the 82nd Airborne would cross the wide, fast-flowing WWII River in flimsy canvas boats, land on the far bank, and seize the northern end of the bridge in a surprise attack. It was a desperate gamble, a daylight amphibious assault against a prepared enemy. The men chosen for this perilous task were from the 3rd Battalion of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, commanded by Major Julian Cook. While they waited for the boats to arrive, the battle for Arnhem was reaching its tragic climax. The remnants of the 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions, along with the newly arrived 4th Parachute Brigade, which had dropped into a hornet's nest on the 18th, were being systematically destroyed west of the city. The British were forced to abandon any hope of reaching the bridge. The surviving elements of the 1st Airborne Division were pushed back into a small, thumb-shaped pocket around the village of Oosterbeek, west of Arnhem, with their backs to the Rhine. Their new mission was simply to survive. At the Arnhem Bridge, John Frost's battalion was in its death throes. After 3 days of continuous fighting, their positions were a smouldering ruin. The Germans brought in Tiger tanks, which methodically blew the British-held buildings apart. With most of their men dead or wounded, and with ammunition all but gone, the defenders' resistance began to falter. That evening, a temporary truce was called to allow the Germans to evacuate the British wounded, including Colonel Frost, who had been injured in the leg. By the morning of Thursday, September 21st, it was over. The last handful of defenders, out of ammunition and utterly exhausted, surrendered. For 4 days, against overwhelming odds, a single light infantry battalion had held the north end of the Arnhem Bridge. They had done everything asked of them and more, but the relief force had not arrived. On the afternoon of Wednesday, September 20th, one of the most heroic actions of the entire war took place at Nijmegen. The canvas assault boats for the WWII crossing had finally arrived. At 3 p.m., under the cover of a smoke screen and a furious bombardment from British tanks and artillery, the first wave of Major Cook's paratroopers paddled frantically across the 400-yard-wide river. They were exposed for the entire crossing, and the German defenders on the far bank poured a murderous fire of machine guns, mortars, and 20 mm cannons into their ranks. The canvas boats offered no protection. Men were killed and wounded in the water, and boats were ripped to shreds. Of the 26 boats in the first wave, only 13 made it across. But they made it. The surviving paratroopers, drenched and furious, stormed up the steep northern bank and, in a fit of desperate rage, overran the German positions. Wave after wave of boats followed, each one braving the hail of fire. The cost was terrible, but the foothold was secured. As the American paratroopers fought their way towards the northern end of the bridge, their incredible sacrifice finally broke the stalemate. The German defenders, seeing the Americans on the northern bank and facing a renewed assault from the Guards' tanks on the southern end, finally cracked. In a wild dash, tanks from the Grenadier Guards, their machine guns blazing, raced across the Nijmegen Bridge, which the Germans, in the chaos, had failed to demolish. The bridge was taken. It was 7 p.m. on Wednesday. The road to Arnhem, just 11 miles away, was open. But it was too late. The light was failing, and the Guards, exhausted and wary of reports of German armor ahead, halted for the night. That hesitation, while understandable from a tactical standpoint, was a death sentence for the men at Oosterbeek. The battle for the Oosterbeek perimeter was a week-long epic of courage and endurance. The remnants of the British 1st Airborne Division, around 3,500 men, held a small, shrinking pocket of land centered on the Hartenstein Hotel, which had been General Urquhart's headquarters. They were surrounded and under constant attack from an overwhelming force of German infantry, tanks, and artillery. The fighting was at close quarters, in the gardens and houses of the quiet residential suburb. The Germans, recognizing they had the British trapped, subjected the perimeter to a relentless and terrifying bombardment from mortars and artillery. The paratroopers, dug in slit trenches and ruined basements, could do little but endure it. The aid stations, set up in the cellars of the Hartenstein and other buildings, were overwhelmed with wounded. Medical supplies ran out, and the surgeons were forced to operate without anesthetic, using captured German equipment. The situation was utterly hopeless, but the Red Devils refused to give in. They fought with a tenacity that astonished the Germans. Every German attack was met with a furious counterattack. They were sustained by a single, desperate hope that WWII's corps would break through and relieve them. On Thursday, September 21st, the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, commanded by Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, was finally dropped south of the Rhine. Their drop was a disaster. They landed under heavy fire, far from their intended zones, and suffered heavy casualties. Their mission had been to cross the Rhine and reinforce the Osterbeek pocket, but they had no boats and were facing a determined enemy on the riverbank. Over the next few days, they made several valiant but doomed attempts to cross the river at night. A few hundred Poles managed to make it across, but they were too few to make a difference. The final attempts by WWII's corps to reach the beleaguered division also failed. A ground attack towards the perimeter was stopped cold by the well-entrenched Germans. The dream of Operation Market Garden was dead. By Monday, September 25th, it was clear that the Osterbeek pocket was no longer tenable. The defenders were at the end of their tether. They had no food, very little water, and were almost out of ammunition. The perimeter was on the verge of collapse. That evening, the order was given to evacuate. Under the cover of darkness and a torrential downpour, Operation Berlin began. Engineers from WWII's corps paddled small boats across the turbulent Rhine to ferry the survivors back to the southern bank. The evacuation was a desperate and chaotic affair. Men, many of them wounded, made their way down a muddy, treacherous slope to the riverbank, under constant threat of German fire. They waded into the cold water, hoping to find a place in one of the few boats. Many were drowned or hit by shells and machine gun fire. It was a harrowing end to a week of hell. When the sun rose on Tuesday, September 26th, the firing in Osterbeek had stopped. The Germans moved in to find only the dead and the thousands of wounded who had been left behind. Of the more than 10,000 men of the British 1st Airborne Division who had landed at Arnhem, only about 2,400 made it back across the Rhine. The division had been effectively destroyed. Operation Market Garden was a failure. The audacious gamble had not paid off. The Allies had not crossed the Rhine. The Siegfried Line had not been outflanked, and the war would not be over by Christmas. The failure was due to a combination of factors. A plan that was too optimistic and rigid. A fatal underestimation of German strength and resilience. Critical intelligence failures. The disastrous choice of landing zones at Arnhem, the breakdown of radio communications, and the fatal dependency on a single road for the ground advance. Yet, amid the strategic failure, the operation produced moments of incredible bravery and sacrifice that have become legendary. The desperate stand of Frost's men at the Arnhem Bridge, the heroic charge of the American paratroopers across the Vaal River, and the week-long agony of the Osterbeek pocket are testaments to the endurance and courage of the soldiers who fought there. The legacy of Market Garden is complex. For the Allies, it was a bitter defeat, a stark reminder that the war was far from over. For the Dutch people in the northern Netherlands, The failure of the operation condemned them to the terrible hunger winter, a famine in which tens of thousands of civilians starved to death. But for the men who fought there, particularly the survivors of the 1st Airborne Division, it became a symbol of honor and sacrifice, a battle fought against impossible odds. The bridge at Arnhem had indeed been a bridge too far, but the struggle to capture it would be remembered forever as one of the great epics of military history.